Hello, everybody. I can see that you've all been very studious since earlier on. So I'm going to introduce this session. We're not going to reinvent the candle in order to reinvent electricity. I think that was an excellent sentence. The real citation is to say that, well, that's not how we've invented the electric light bulb. That's the real citation. So, an enterprising Europe. We need to be optimistic to talk about an enterprising Europe. Usually, we think about bureaucracy, technocracy, inefficiencies, but there have been some considerable changes, especially from a budgetary point of view and health point of view and an industrial point of view. And we're going to focus today, given the panel and the participants that we have for this roundtable, on the industrial side of things with the European Commissioner in charge of consumption, and Didier REYNDERS. So let me introduce to you the panel of speakers. I'm going to start with Agnès BENASSY-QUERE, who is one of the best economists, who is part of the Circle and is in charge of the Treasury. She is the coordinator. Hello, Agnès. You're going to be opening the round table. Then we'll have Guillaume FAURY, who is the president of Airbus, the CEO of Airbus, which is one of our European companies par excellence. And next to this speaker, we have an infernal couple. So Carole DELGA, who is president of the Occitanie region, where aviation is the first on the list of economic drivers, so 27,000 employees in Toulouse alone. So I've mentioned already Didier REYNDERS, the European Commissioner in charge of justice, the pillar of Europe, a European who is convinced of Europe's worth, and he will be able to oppose certain arguments against Europe. And then we have the president of Saint-Gobain, Pierre-André de CHALENDAR, so we'll hear more from him. And then we have Jean-Pierre CLAMADIEU, who is at the heart of all of these transitions. He is the president of ENGIE. And then, of course, we have Jacques ATTALI. Do we really have to introduce him anymore? Writer and president, ATTALI et Associés. He's an essay writer, and he will be giving us the conclusion, and he will allow us to project ourselves into the future. Thank you very much, Hedwige. Hello, everybody. Thank you for choosing this session. I'm very happy to see so many people here. You will have understood that there are some major things happening in Europe, and that has been the case for several years. And the keys of our transformation are at European level, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So you will have noticed that there is a build-up of challenges: energy, security, food, macroeconomic challenges, inflation, public finances. Each new challenge requires a coordinated European response, and the community response is becoming stronger every day and at a faster speed. So we've made some major steps when it comes to budgetary coordination at European level because of COVID. So there are some important shared projects that we'll hear about. The CAC, for example. We've got the coordination of sanctions against Russia, coordination of the energy package that's just been voted. So the French presidency has come to an end. I won't go into details about that. Several areas allowed us to make progress. We've got the recovery plan with 100 billion euros reimbursed, initiatives in favor of long-term investment, improving the system, improving transparency for the allowance of green capital for the energy transition. There are the digital question. Perhaps we'll hear more about that from Didier REYNDERS with the agreement on the DMA-DSA, so on competition and protection of consumers in the digital field, the reciprocity tool on the public markets, on the This is important for industrial sovereignty. That's what we were hearing about from Bruno Le Maire this morning. We talk about European sovereignty rather than national sovereignty. And then finally, the best of the very best, the package that's very important with a very ambitious roadmap for the environmental transition. You're familiar with the main aspects of that, and that's really going to structure our strategy for transformation towards a low-carbon economy. And I'll finish with just one aspect of daily life that's not always mentioned. In a year's time, you're able to come back to Aix with just one charger for your mobile phone, because chargers will be interchangeable. So I'll start with questions for the panel, especially with respect to our industrialists. What is your main concern for the coming years when it comes to the environmental transition? Is it capital, financing, shortage of labor, energy, technology, generally speaking, regulations? We talk a lot about regulations, governance. And what are you expecting of Europe, given the situation? What kind of intervention from an energy point of view? What kind of balance between carbon pricing and regulations and subsidies? And what do you think about this Fit for 55 package? Thank you, Agnès, for giving us the basis for the discussion. Guillaume FAURY, in 10 years, in 20 years, we'll be able to come here to Aix in a green aeroplane. Will it be possible? You were saying that aviation is based on 3 pillars, but the 3 pillars were changing, shifting. Explain that to us. Thank you, Hedwige, and hello to everybody. Yes, it really is a pleasure to see you all here on this Sunday morning around this theme. So just to be pragmatic and to try and answer Agnès' question, Airbus is synonymous with European success. We could talk about space, we could talk about defense projects, but I'm just going to talk about commercial aviation, which is where we have the biggest challenge, where it's and it's an area that's simpler to share with you. So the success of Airbus and European aviation before, the environmental crisis is based on fuel, airplanes, using fuel, and regulations, worldwide regulations, making it possible to organize all of that and allowing for the success of European aviation. The figures are simple. The trade balance in France for aviation is 30 billion contributions before 2019, and we're the first contributor. Even during the crisis, we were the first contributor. So oil, that's the energy we use today, but oil has made it possible to make a liquid fuel with a high energy density, making aviation possible, such as we know it today, used by aeroplanes. So we have technologies that are the result of the fact that European countries have pooled their know-how and pooled their investment abilities. And I like to say that if we have a German maker of planes, an English maker of planes, a Spanish maker of planes, and a German maker of planes, we wouldn't have any European maker, because the scale at which we have to work in order to succeed in this field is like America, Europe, China. That's the scale. It's a continental scale. If we want to be competitive, and we can be competitive in Europe, we need to have a European team. Alone, we can go far. We can go fast, but together we can go far. So we needed to work on regulations. We need fuel, therefore. We need airplanes, and we need regulations, as I said. The first thing that was done was to bring what we have together. So we had to move from a national regulation level to European regulation. So the ASA was created, the Aviation Safety Agency, and we have been able to create standards for all of the 27 countries. And now we have a level playing field across the world, and everybody can compete on this level playing field. And when you compete, if you're organized, you can win. So that was before transition. So oil, airplanes using oil, regulations allowing for a high level of safety with these airplanes. So everything has to be reinvented, yes. So the first thing needed is new fuels. We need liquid fuels with a high energy density. That's what we need for aviation. You know, people wonder why we don't use batteries. Batteries don't have the right massive energy density that we need for aviation. So that's why we need liquid fuels called SAFs, Sustainable Aviation Fuels. They are decarbonated. We need a lot of decarbonated energy to make them, or feedstock for making biofuels, and that's something that we can do very quickly, but we've got to organize the sector in order to improve it. So then you need decarbonated aeroplanes. You need to be able to act at European level together for this, but with investments in technology that are very considerable. But we need support. And from that point of view, Europe is there helping us. It's helping us with investments. Europe has decided to help us with the transition through technology, not through growth. That's the right way to go about things. So we have help for technology. I'm optimistic. And coming back to regulations, it's a bit more complicated. You talked about the FIFA 55. Fit for 55s. Europe is a leader when it comes to regulations. But we don't just need regulations just for Europe. We need regulations that are good for the rest of the world. You know, if the rest of the world emits more carbon than us, because there aren't enough investments or innovation in Europe because of the regulations, we'll not get there. So there are lots of good things, but we still have our work cut out for us, and that work has to be carried out together. Now, of course, we'll talk about all of these questions. We'll talk about, you know, just doing things in Europe rather than across the world, and whether that's a good thing or not. So, Carole, you work with companies, with, you know, your right-hand, left-hand neighbors. How do you work with the state as well, and how do you work at European level? Hello, everybody. So to rise to the challenge, as Guillaume said, it's all about partnership. It's absolutely essential to be able to work in a complementary manner with different entities and not to work in silos. There's the institutional aspect as well at state level in France. There's a lot of dynamic cooperation with the rest of Europe. And then in our country, it's important to have the right local authorities working on the questions that are important, sovereignty. The regions are leaders, and we need to see things changing in terms of culture. In Europe, our culture is recognized, but in France, we still have some efforts to make over the next 5-year period. So the regions have a power and can act on the entire supply chain, because Airbus, objectively, doesn't need the region. However, Airbus does like the fact that the region can help with small SMEs that need to invest in a niche market that will be useful to Airbus. So the region can be there not just to provide financial help, but to help with the transformations required, because in the aviation sector, that's something that's important. And we need to be drivers when it comes to research and innovation. I'm president of all regions in France, but I always say to my colleagues that it's the first 20 regions investing in R&D. It is Occitanie. That's the condition of our competitiveness for the future. So you mustn't bring down the credits when it comes to research and innovation, because it makes it possible to be flexible in managing projects at national level or European level. It's important to be flexible, to be adaptable. There's also another subject, and that is the question of transport infrastructures. At European level, we need to have a big development plan for developing transport infrastructures so that we can bring down greenhouse gas emissions over the next 5 or 6 years. So public transport is essential. I defend the idea of a green airplane. It's not just because aviation is my industry and it creates employment. It's the question of the green airplane. It's not about the environment. It's about the design of society. Either we want a society that brings together people, and in which case we need airplanes, but we need to have a decarbonized airplane, And I'm saying this in all seriousness. I'm seeing so many different types of populism emerging in the world and in Europe. And we've seen a modification of the National Assembly as well, which is quite considerable. So we need to develop the question of green airplanes. 100 million euros has been the contribution of Occitanie. For our companies to be competitive, we also need to have know-how sovereignty. And I was happy to hear the Prime Minister say this. We have a major challenge in France. We have to adapt the educational system to these necessary transitions, the energy transition, the environmental transition as well. And then there's the question of renewable energies. We need a Europe with a strategy for renewable energy, with high ambitions. In French states, in other states as well, but especially in French states, in the French state, we need to lighten things. So there's the question of a floating wind farm. We need to have courage to do that, but we need to lighten the standards to be able to do that. So I can see that Jean-Pierre is itching to speak, but I forgot to say that you were a minister, you're president of the French regions, and you were asked to become a minister in the current government. Is that true? Yes. Yes, I was offered the position of Prime Minister, in fact. But it's important to be consistent. If you look at my political career, credibility, consistency, those are the best remedies against populism. So, Didier REYNDERS, were you asked to be president of the European Commission? No, more seriously, you can see that the European Commission is at the heart of this enterprising Europe. How are you seeing things, knowing that your position, because of the functions you occupy, you're focused on consumers? Yes, first of all, hello. No, I wasn't asked to find trade-offs inside the National Assembly, although I have a certain amount of expertise. So when we talk about Europe, an enterprising Europe, in the European Commission, to be enterprising, we know that Europe has to be digital. It has to work on a sustainable economy. So to have a digital Europe, we have to have a new regulatory framework. And to open up the market, we need to allow SMEs and startups to have access to data, not to be blocked by the big GAFAMs. It's also important to make sure that you are safe when you're using digital technology. I'm thinking about the obligations of withdrawing the hate messages and withdrawing dangerous products in a very fast, in a very quick manner. So we've worked on these approaches, and innovation is at the heart of digital developments in Europe when it comes to investment, when it comes to research and development in the area. When it comes to sustainable development, we've worked with an objective where we're looking at decarbonizing Europe. There will be a transition period taking us through to 2030 with a whole series of measures. What's important is that what we're doing in Europe, it has to have an impact at international level. If we're working on the sustainable development, this is as part of the Paris agreements. Even if in the United States things have been happening there, but it's important for us to work together. So this is what we did in the Commission, but then we had two major crises. And there was the enterprising spirit that we saw in these crises. The COVID crisis, a lot of research was carried out. We were able to develop vaccines, and we have the first vaccine production platform. We exported as many vaccines as we used in the European Union. We were the only ones in the world. The United States was closing its borders, not only to vaccines, but also to components. And, of course, there is the digital certificate, this COVID certificate that you've probably used. That's a European invention. It's used not only in the Union, but on the 5 continents. 40 countries have joined us, and on your mobile phone, you have this certificate that probably will continue to be useful in the autumn and winter, depending on how the epidemic develops. And then there is the Ukraine crisis. I won't explain to you what we're doing in terms of sanctions, collecting evidence of crimes, war crimes, and how we're managing the sanctions by seizing the assets of certain oligarchs. And then there's the defense budget. There are some considerable changes taking place in the defense sector. Sweden, Finland wanting to join us, Germany deciding to bring up its GDP and its defense expenditure by 2%. And then we've got what's happening in the aviation sector. So we need to have a defense industrial policy. We're going to be working on that. How are we doing this? When it comes to health, well, we've developed tools. COVID has allowed us to set up a common European debt. This is something that we didn't have. 800 billion euros, recovery plans so that we could invest in digital technologies. So everything that is being done through these policies aims to make sure that we have companies that respect values. The union is based on values. This is what we do in the states, so with the state of law in different nations, but at European level, we're trying to put human beings at the center of the policies that we're developing. We saw this with the general regulations on data protection. So we're seeing other things now that we're working on, other regulations where we can have an impact outside of Europe. We adopted a text in February in the Commission. We're working on the duty of vigilance that companies have in what they do, in what their subsidiaries do, across the whole value chain. We're checking that there's no negative impact on the environment, but also on human rights, forced labor, child labor. It's about projecting values. And we're doing this with all European companies, but also companies outside of Europe, but who are working on the domestic market. So the key word here is innovation, obviously. And even if this is a difficult debate in many European countries, I have to say that innovation and training go hand in hand with the reform of the labor market and the need to find new people so that to have access to the labor market. The baby boom is being transformed into a baby boom, and we will probably need some kind of economic migration. But maybe we'll talk about that in another forum when the National Assembly has stabilized. So in a few years' time then. So Pierre Richard, so the baby boom. President of CEO of Saint-Gobain, you're at the heart of this environmental transition. We're seeing the difficulty of changing regulations, of changing Europe even. What is your stance? What are you asking of Europe? Well, 2 observations to answer Agnès' question. First of all, a macroeconomic observation. Companies, when it comes to environmental transition, they've already started doing things. So they've already started doing concrete things. They have solutions. Saint-Gobain focuses a lot on solutions. Decarbonization solutions. They're decarbonizing their processes. They're reviewing their purchasing policies so that there is less transport, more circularity, and more of a local focus. So a second point is a macro point. All of this is going to require a lot of investment. It's going to cost a lot of money. And above all, we're going to need an awful lot of decarbonized energy, a bit of biogas. But I think that the big subject, what we're really going to need is a lot of decarbonized electricity, much more than what we're hearing about with the French plans and European plans. I think we're getting it wrong there. So it's going to be a big problem in the coming years. It means that all energy sources need to be decarbonized, and it must be cheap. In other words, a lot cheaper than carbon-based energy. We need some kind of payback for our investments, so that it's worth moving on to decarbonized electricity. So that's the macro observation is a bit more difficult. What can Europe do? I think that we need Europe, but Europe needs to do more. Today we have a problem. Many things have been done, and Jean-Pierre will come back to that. Lots of things have been done, but they've been done with not enough oomph. Energy is not a European expertise. There is no European energy policy. It's not the fault of the Commission, it's because of the states. So the Commission has tackled the subject of energy, especially electricity, via two things: the competition policy and the environmental policy. And in the field of competition, there is the liberal angle, and there is what electricity is and how it doesn't work very well today. We've got lots of dysfunctional problems in the short term. We've got the price of electricity and what's going to happen in the next 3 months with that price. We could talk about gas as well, but the things that are a lot worse in connection with electricity. So we've got short-term problems, but I think that it's the opportunity to redefine electricity prices. We've got to look at the basics, look at the foundation. We've got to have the right kind of policy. We've got to look at supply security. The signals being sent by Brussels based on the competition policy are not signals that are really fostering investment that we need in the long term, because they're signals that they're very much based on the market. And I believe that we need a lot more planning. We need a lot more environmental planning. I think that we need a European level, like in the United States, you've got states and then there's the federal states. Interconnection is absolutely essential. Renewable energies are posing a lot more challenges than centralized electricity. So, and I think as the Minister of the Polish Minister of Energy says that, perhaps you said it, Commissioner. So we found vaccines without a health policy in Europe. I hope that the energy crisis is going to allow us to have a real energy policy for Europe.
Thank you very much. Perhaps your neighbour has got the beginning of an answer. Well, perhaps I might have a beginning of an answer. We often talk together on this subject. Let's take a look in the rearview mirror for a minute. As we're exiting this crisis, the COVID crisis, Europe has set itself some ambitious climate objectives: neutrality by 2050, this famous 5.5% in 2030, and they've just submitted to the Council a whole series of regulations for Fit for 55. But that creates a very coherent framework. It's ambitious. It's reasonably effective to achieve these objectives. I think all industrialists in this room or on this stage will say that not everything is perfect. There are many relevant facts there, but let's be delighted to note that Europe is present and offensive on this front, and setting itself some ambitions, using the right tools that will take it there. And then we were hit by the Ukraine war, and all of a sudden we discovered that energy problems was not only having decarbonized energy, but also to have reasonable prices. And there, the European response is quite acceptable, because it was a collective response. Europe came up with a new project. Europe likes catchy phrases, so this is Repower Europe. So it's a series of proposals that aims to do two things, i.e. rise to the current crisis. Yes, we are facing a crisis, but secondly, to speed up the energy transition. I think we really are striving to make sure that this war in Ukraine and the discovery of strategic fragility and the desire to have energy independence will work in favor of the climate strategy. But it's not easy, because we're all worried about what's going to happen in the next few months. We're all focused on the short term. But by the same token, my colleagues have said that we must keep moving forward in this direction. And then we've got the European system, which works, given the context whereby there are risks in terms of supplies of gas, there are risks in France in terms of electricity supply, but the markets are working, the European system is working, even though there is a major weak point, that is that we do not have a European policy on our energy mix. We've put in place the tools, but we've told each state to define what they want. And the elephant in the room is nuclear energy, of course, because we don't have any consensus there. We don't have any consensus about the role nuclear energy must play. But the system works. The market gives us some market price indications, which seem a bit surprising to us. But at the end of the day, we've got French power plants. 3 or 4 of these power plants are using liquid natural gas, liquefied natural gas, which is used for electricity purposes, which means that we are dealing with the short term without putting the long term in peril. Repower Europe is an acceleration of the path towards renewable energies. And I was listening to Carole DELGA with great attention because in France, the regulations are very difficult. We industrialists have a responsibility. NG recently launched a label because we noticed that here and there, we and our competitors haven't managed to create or to generate trust and confidence. So we're dragging back. Having wind turbines out at sea is a massive way of producing renewable energies. I went to a wind farm off Belgium last Thursday. There are 5 gigawatts of capacity in this wind farm within the space of 2 or 3 years. We're lagging behind in France. And as far as gas is concerned, we need to move along as well. Repower EU is another way of telling the member states and the economic players in Europe, as telling them this is what we can do to speed things up. Then we have to organize ourselves correctly. The Commission isn't always the most efficient in the short term, so it relies on the states. But here again, to continue in this positive note, I think given this unexpected major crises, we are nevertheless managing to find an equilibrium between the short term and the medium and long term. How can short term difficulties speed up the transition? I just want to wrap up here by talking about funding. Here, a bit more critical. We need finance. Money has been free up until recent times, but now we can see the interest rates going up. Investors are a little bit more cautious. We've invented taxonomy, which is a kind of compass which can tell investor what's green and what's not green. We can point them in the right direction in their investments. I'm sure that conceptually there's been a tiny error in the way this compass has been calibrated, because it's pointing towards ideal green economy in 2050. But what we really need to be looking at is the transition towards that economy. Thank you very much. Just one point before Jacques ATTALI takes the floor. We see that the nuclear issue is tricky. Nuclear is being relaunched in France, a bit in Belgium too, but there's an argument ongoing with Belgium because there were some nuclear plants in Belgium that you want to stop, the Europeans want to stop, but the Belgians want to continue with them. So we can see that it's not easy. We can't make all the planets aligned between the states and the business. Well, nuclear energy is a medium to long-term industry. If it will take 5 years and 5 years of investment to bring them up to date. The Belgian law ends in 2025. We should have taken this decision in the past. The government has said that if we really want to go ahead, well, we're not talking about the conditions. But nuclear energy is not something you just switch on and off. You need massive investments and you need to prepare. Yes, I just wanted to highlight how difficult it is to have an energy mix. Jacques ATTALI, you've heard all the different points of view that have been raised. There's a question of creating a European energy supply chain. In your eyes, what is important for us to move forward in this entrepreneurial Europe. Oh, there have been so many things to talk about. I've listened to such exciting things, and I'm not going to contradict anyone who's spoken this morning. I'll just make 3 comments. The first comment is that we've known about this energy problem for at least 20 years. We've known that the climate is in danger, and we could have been acting over these past 20 years. So now it's a disaster. All of this wasted time is a disaster. So are the industrialists the guilty party? I don't think so. I think it's the public authorities who are supposed to be creating the right conditions so that the industrialists get down to work through rules and regulations rather than through pricing. I think regulations have a huge role to play in terms of anticipating threats. And in that space of 20 years, we could have done something, but we did not. And I'd like to point out that a very powerful European institution with lots of resources, which hasn't been mentioned because we haven't talked about it yet, is the leading European institution in terms of combating against climate problems. And this is the bank, the European Bank, and it has a major role to play. And we should have got down to this a long time ago. So first comment, let's treat problems when they arise and not 20 years later. Second comment, as have already been said on several occasions, Europe is only a small part of our planet. And if we do things only in Paris, then it's not really much use. Even more, even to a greater extent, if you're just working in France or on a regional basis. So we need to have a global, international approach, a planetary approach. Europe can be the beacon. It can also create worldwide standards. Very often in the past, others have set the standards. And those people who have created the standards don't necessarily apply them, but we do. And so I think that the key today for the issue in hand is how Europe can become a leader in setting European standards, or setting international, worldwide standards. And so the taxonomy mentioned by Mr. CLAMADIEU was very, very important. And non-financial accountability also is very important. It's vital to ensure that this is an incentive to improve the situation where the situation is not very good, rather than focusing on those who are already doing the job. I could refer to a rather simplified message. These standards are put in place by the rich, and they're only of any use to the rich. However, those who do not have the resources to enhance their situation, i.e. the southern countries, are simply reinforcing the privileges of those who are in a very cushy position to begin with. And so giving money to those who are well off is a mistake. And that's what we're preparing to do, both in taxonomy and the extra financial accounting. This is a wrong way of reasoning, and it can be explained by the rich people all getting together to decide the rules, and they're deploying those rules. I think we have to treat these problems when they arise and not 20 years later. And today, the problems which I can see arising go well beyond energy. We have been stressing that subject here, but there are other issues at stake. What is currently destroying society and our planet is not only the climate. There's other forces at play. Imagine a planet with a perfect climate, but where there are no schools, no healthcare systems, where there's no food, and where there's no democracy. That would be chaos. And that's what we're heading towards right now, because we're not doing anything worthwhile to address the question of replacing this economy of death, i.e. replacing these systems where there's all this kind of poison which is killing us, where we're talking about artificial sugars and everything linked to chemicals, and they're all very catastrophic. And we're not doing anything for those sectors in the economy of life, education, health, renewable housing, sustainable transport, all of these things, and you align them all up, and I was amazed when I saw the figures. The economy of life in Europe and around the planet is not 40% of GDP. The economy of death is 60% of GDP. So we really have to change that ratio. We can't wait any longer. Before problems pile up, in European countries, we are seeing under 5% dedicated to education, over 15% to pension, and over 30% to fossil fuels. That is just not right. It's not right. And it's going to cost us a lot in the long run because we will no longer have people who are trained properly. And if you take a look at the rest of the world, where education is a catastrophe and health is a catastrophe, we'll be in the same situation as them. So if we come back here in 20 years' time and we say, oh, well, let's start taking a look at schools and education and health, that's too late. We need to start today. Many questions in there, but has anyone got a reaction to what Jacques Attali has to say? Perhaps the industrialists amongst us. Any reactions there? Well, we can only agree with what he said, of course. Guillaume FAURY? One of the subjects that concern us industrialists, and also individuals working in these businesses, and that is the question of education. I think the biggest injustice in the world and the greatest fragility of our societies are those who do have access to education. They can survive, they can do well in their lives, they're in control of their lives, they make their choices. Those who do not have access to expertise and to knowledge and training, they are finding it difficult to pick out a path through life. And I think that's even bigger risk than the climate risk. We need to sort this problem out so that we can then address the question of the climate. There's going to be so much instability for the investments that we're making rapidly now for the transition. And so that's what we're worried about. And, well, that's why I was calling you into the conversation. Jean-Pierre CLAMADIEU? Yes, I was going to react on a different point. Europe is 9% of greenhouse gases. So it's great that we focus on this subject. However, in all of our different policies, we have to seek out to bring other regions of the world, developed countries on subjects pertaining to industry, but also the poorest countries, bring them on board so that we can all succeed in this transition. Yet we're not going to succeed if we only work in Europe alone. Guillaume FAURY there was a question about your speech. In Europe, as we did for healthcare, do we need a supply chain for rare raw materials in Europe? You gave an interview and you said that in the moment I am making gliders because I don't have any engines to put in airplanes. I think you were kind of exaggerating a little bit there, perhaps. But is that what you're expecting from Europe? Well, from Europe, we want a policy which secures the supply chain in the short and medium terms. It's harder in the long term. So when you compare us to China and the United States, who are strategic rivals, we have much less security in terms of supply in Europe, and that has two consequences. Firstly, we have to do a lot more of circular economy and recycling, and that means consuming a lot of energy. That is why we need more energy than we think we need, and I agree with what Attali said and CLAMADIEU too. The second thing is that we have these big airplanes. Other areas of the world have a lot of natural resources, but perhaps they have less prosperity in terms of their industries. We need to work hand in hand to secure a long-term supply chain. Europe was built on the idea of trade. It's a trade leading to creativity, freedom, and projecting a European model around the world. We can see the limits to that today because the world is becoming de-globalized. And I believe we need to take on board this dimension in our European policies, and we have to get back to strategic autonomy that is not only to the edges of our own region, but we have to go beyond that. Trade is not the answer to everything. You've all said what you're expecting from Europe, what you want Europe to do. However, how do we fund all of this? How do we and this is very subject which is dear to the heart of Agnès BENASSY-QUERE, how do we face these huge expenses? How do we fund all of these transformations? Jacques ATTALI. Well, I think we're making a huge mistake in our anti-inflation policy. It's not a question of demand, it's just insufficient supply. So what we need to do is increase supply to develop this economy of life, and we have to take a look at all that we've done. We have to offer, in order to facilitate demand, you have to really go into the supply side. We all know about that. Whatever the cost that we've experienced in the past couple of years, we have to channel that into supply. We're not there yet. There's a long road ahead of us, but this is a choice which has to be made. Everything will boil down to our ability to get projects up and running which give us the supply that we need. And if we do this, whatever it costs in terms of supply will be possible within the realm of available resources, so as long as we reduce that, whatever the cost, in terms of demand. Well, in terms of funding, what we did with our recovery plans, we had that common European debt, 800 billion euros. We had investments in all kinds of areas to support the digitization of economy and public services in many fields, education, justice, and sectors which were really lagging behind in terms of digital technologies. And we are going to continue working on supply on that front. And to get back to the energy plan, we need to identify how we can produce as much as possible. Taxonomy, we've talked about this subject as well. We've heard enough about integrating our different technologies, and it's not only at the European Union, but this is right now. This can be done despite the European Union's rather idealistic point of view. Final point on energy, and in terms of supply, in our recovery plans, what we did not use was loans, because money was so cheap, no one was asking for a loan. And so now we have 300 billion euros, which is quite a sum, for all investments in interconnection between energies. This is a huge challenge in Europe. Countries today are not being able to get their supplies in. Interconnection will address that problem. And to get back to Jacques Attali, I would say that there's a national debate and there's a European debate. But for all of these matters, Europe did not have, but that has changed now, did not have any skills or competency. But now we are creating competencies by hopping from one crisis to the next. I've got a colleague who said to me just the other day, that person is in charge of healthcare, and they knew that they were going to start a big think tank. Thanks to COVID, we have been able to invest in a European healthcare system. And that war is triggering thoughts on European defense. I'm in charge of justice, for example. When I look at the question of education, Europe says it's a national problem. Don't poke your nose in there. So I think, so what you're saying is we need a crisis in terms of education. When I hear industrialists telling me we need training, we need better schools, we have to accept that some European funds have to be invested in those educational projects throughout Europe, and not just year after year think about national reforms of education, which are very rarely deployed. Carole DELGA, perhaps? I think here, in the past 2 years, we have witnessed something which is founded in the market. Europe has become a public power in terms of healthcare strategy, defense strategy, and now we have to draw up a very strong sovereignty strategy for industry and energy. And coming back to the question of energy sovereignty and the energy mix and renewable energies, we really need to have Europe to help France along. When I see the French, how reluctant they are to join in with these projects, such as these wind parks. We have more sea than anyone else. We are the second power in the world in terms of sea and oceans. And so here we have scope. We have room for maneuver here. And we really have to be brave enough to stand up and defend these projects. But when you go to your population, in my region, Occitania, we've got a couple of wind farms which are being built out at sea. When I was in the election campaign, I was talking about it. It was a project which wasn't getting people very excited. But if you're committed to it, you can win people over. And so national sovereignty will be the winner there. And the Prime Minister has said that we really do reform education here in France because it has become a machine of despair. The youngsters are in despair, families are in despair, nobody can see a better future for their children. This is a machine that is really goes against the grain of competitiveness for our businesses because the students we are training are not enlightened and the future employees do not have the right skills. So, Hedwige, it's really important to say this. As Europeans, we have to have vision because I know what each state has the right to do. But we need to talk about an education policy which advances hand in hand with the business world. We must say goodbye to education that's closed in on itself. And it must open up to the world of business. It's absolutely vital. I thought we had until 10:15, but in fact we only have until 10 past 11. I thought we had up to 11:15, but we only have till 11:10, so our time is up. I want to come back on that question of the scale of time. We have to look forward. We have to anticipate. It pertains to education and energy. But an industrialist makes an investment over 20 years. So to be net zero carbon by 2030, then the industrialists, better get their fingers out. So I think the markets, and I agree that price isn't the only regulatory tool, but the price signal must not be contrary to regulations. I'm afraid we have no time left to talk about this question. Agnès, do you want to wrap up here? Okay, just in a couple of words. I'm really delighted because I've had some answers to the questions I had in my head. I hope the audience has too. So the most important questions seem to be to speed up decarbonized energies, to go forward with the wind farms out at sea and the rest of it. And the question of standards is important as well, and taxonomy, and using these standards around the globe. You did not mention the instrument for adjusting carbon at borders. And from that point of view, I would be less negative than Jacques ATTALI, who said that we haven't done anything over the past 20 years. I think the experiments that have been carried out in the ETS market, which we haven't talked about either, well, we'll have to have another round table about that. I believe we have reduced industry's greenhouse gas emissions here in Europe, and so some things do work. Thank you, everybody.